Today we're going to talk about the rhetorical situation. Before you begin writing any text, analyze the rhetorical situation by asking yourself a series of specific questions. What am I being asked to write about? That's your topic. What is new or has changed recently about this topic? That's your angle. What exactly is the assignment asking me to do or to accomplish? That's your purpose. Who will read this document and what do they expect? This is your readers. Where and when will they be reading the document? This is the context. So in the textbook, there was a good graphic about how all 5 of those sections overlap. So you'll see that it's not just 2 go together, but they all go together. There's a little bit of each part in each part of the paper. So let's practice. Think about an event that you endured that helped transform you into the person you are right now. And when I say endured, if you can go to something that was particularly difficult to get through, that would be best. Make sure it brings a strong emotion and is something you want to talk about. So if it is something you're not quite at a place where you're ready to share it, pick something else because this is building on to something. Pause the video here and continue when you finished writing down your event. The angle. What is new about this topic? On just about every issue, someone has already said something. This is kind of the area in composition, arguments about pro-life, pro-choice, or pro-gay marriage or against gay marriage. This is where it gets very stale and boring for the teacher. So you have to talk about something that's new about it. You have to find your angle. So is there any new information about your topic? For example, a few months ago, students could write about whether or not they were for or against gay marriage, meaning should a law be written that made gay marriage legal. Well, now that a law has been written to make gay marriage legal, we have to change the context of how we talk about that now. Do we need to repeal the law, or is the law fine? Does it encompass enough? What are the social and political and financial ramifications of that law? So that topic in itself is morphing. What unique experiences, expertise, or knowledge do you possess that you can bring to the topic? A lot of times writers forget that the most important research in their paper is themselves. Don't discount what you've been through. Think about the event that you just wrote down. It's likely that you received support from a group. This group may have been in the community, at church, or at school. It could have even been a family group. In 3 to 5 sentences, describe how belonging to this group helped you through the event. Or describe how the members of this group brought you into their community. Pause the video here to complete this action. The next thing you need to figure out is, why are you writing? This is also known as the author's purpose. And just so you know, it is never because your teacher told you to. Most academic papers are written for 2 reasons, either to give information or to persuade. In composition rhetoric classes, we're building towards persuasion. We're building towards you making an argument and convincing other people why your argument is correct. So you'll see specific verbs in the context of the topic questions your teachers will give you. And here's a list. Informative papers are going to ask you to inform, to describe, to define, explain. Persuasive papers are going to ask you to convince, to argue, to recommend. So these verbs here tell you what type of academic paper you need to write. And it also tells you how forceful you need to make your language in your paper. What kinds of words do you use to either tell us what's going on or to persuade us that your opinion is correct. So let's write a purpose statement. Look back at the event you described and the community that helped you through it. What is the most important thing belonging to this group showed you? Do you think you would be informing your reader or persuading your reader? Write your purpose statement. The purpose statement should be 2 to 3 sentences long, and these sentences will be rough. So we're not looking for perfection here, we're just looking for a general idea. So for example, if you started high school at a different high school than most of your 8th grade friends went to, was there a specific social group at school or academic group or campus group that helped you kind of feel like you belonged? I understand my best friend was in band and she found that that was a great outlet because a lot of her friends weren't going to her school. So pause the video here and write your purpose statement. The thesis statement. A thesis statement makes an assertion or claim about your paper's topic. It's debatable. It presents the controlling idea of the paper. And you should be able to write your thesis based on your own thoughts, arguments, and information from your sources. But you'll start with what you think. Now, there is a formula for writing a thesis statement. You have your limited subject plus your opinion equals your thesis statement. One type of thesis statement that a lot of students like to write is a thesis statement with points. When I say points, when you argue or tell anyone anything, the general rule of thumb is you need to be able to explain that in three separate ways or with three separate events. But 3 is the magical number. That's where you kind of get that 5-paragraph essay that you wrote in high school. Introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. Of course, now that we're in college, we're going to get away from that 3 body paragraph paper, but we still have 3 points, but we're just going to be expanding that a bit. So sometimes if you know what your 3 points might be, you can include those in your thesis, and it makes a really clear roadmap to what you're going to talk about in the paper. So I want to talk first about what a thesis is not. It is not a fact or observation. For example, people use many lawn chemicals. This isn't debatable, but a thesis statement here would be, people are poisoning the environment with chemicals merely to keep their lawns clean. So this, you can see, is a position statement, and you can tell by words like poisoning that the author has a specific opinion about lawn chemicals. A thesis statement is also not a title. So Social Security and old age. That's just basically a topic, and it's very broad, and you have to narrow that down because you could talk about Social Security for 40,000 pages. So a good thesis with that title in mind is continuing changes in the Social Security system make it almost impossible to plan intelligently for one's retirement. So they're going to be talking about what's going on with the Social Security system and how that's impacting people trying to plan for retirement. A thesis statement must be specific. It cannot be too vague. So, for example, a thesis statement cannot be too vague, and it has to be specific. So here's an example of one that's too broad. The American steel industry has many problems. You cannot, in one paper, address every problem in the American steel industry. Too narrow. The American steel industry's problems persist in one major area, its funds. Probably you're not going to be able to get very far in a paper with a thesis this narrow, because you need to be able to expand a little bit. And according to this thesis, you could only talk about its funds. So here's a specific one. The primary problem of the American steel industry is the lack of funds to renovate outdated plants, equipment, and major properties. So you see here, this is a thesis statement with points. The writer is going to talk about the lack of funds to renovate outdated plans, number 1. Number 2, equipment, and number 3, major properties. It's also talking about funds, but we've got an idea of exactly what kind of funds. So here's another example of something too broad. Hemingway's war stories are very good. That might be getting you to what you think about Hemingway, which might eventually lead to a thesis. It's too broad as it is. So here's a specific one. Hemingway's stories helped create a new prose style by employing extensive dialogue, shorter sentences, and strong Anglo-Saxon words. So now we have information about Hemingway's contribution to literature, and we have 3 points on which we are going to discuss them. A thesis statement has one main point rather than several main points. So here's an example of a thesis statement with more than 1 point. Stephen Hawking's physical disability has not prevented him from becoming a world-renowned physicist, and his book is the subject of a movie. Those are 2 separate topics. So those would actually be 2 separate papers. One about him being a world-renowned physicist, and the other about his book being the subject of a movie. So simply to change that, you just take off the part about the book being a movie. Stephen Hawking's physical disability has not prevented him from becoming a world-renowned physicist. So how do you develop a thesis statement? There are 3 basic stages to consider during the writing process of a thesis statement. You're going to start with your preliminary or open thesis. You're going to move on to a tentative or working thesis, and then finally to your final thesis. So your purpose statement that we talked about before is kind of getting at the preliminary or open thesis. It's kind of rough. You've got the general idea of what you're looking for, but you're not quite there yet. Your final thesis usually evolves only after considerable reading, writing, and thinking has been done on your topic, and sometimes it's the last thing in your paper to be revised. So, for example, your history teacher gives you a topic of an essay question. Compare and contrast the reasons why the North and South fought the Civil War. So you start thinking about it and you say, well, they fought him for a lot of reasons. So the North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons, some of which were the same and some different. That is really broad, so you've got to narrow it down, but at least you're thinking. So your tentative thesis might move to, while both sides fought the Civil War over the issue of slavery, the North fought for moral reasons, while the South fought to preserve its own institutions. You're talking about the issue of slavery, but you're also going to compare the North and South on that specific issue and how that impacted the Civil War. So moving a little further, you come up with, while both Northerners and Southerners believed they fought against tyranny and oppression, Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their rights to property and self-government. So we have a compare and contrast over slavery, and then kind of how the North felt and how the South felt. It's obviously going to be a compare and contrast because you're saying words like both. So now let's take your purpose statement and start working on a thesis. Pause the video to do so. When you're writing a paper, the last step in the rhetorical situation is to consider your reader. How you consider your reader, you can use the journalist's questions. And those are the 5 W's and 1 H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. So to put those words in context of how you figure out who your reader is, you ask yourself these questions. Who are my readers? What do they need and want? Where will they read this? When will they read this? Why are they reading this? And how will they read this? You need to think about your readers' values. So those involve social beliefs, social conventions, and cultural expectations. What kind of personal values makes your readers different or unique? What about customs of their societies? Do your readers do things in their own social circles? What are their cultural values? What do people in your readers' culture value? How are they like and how are they unlike your own values? So this kind of puts your thesis in context as far as you want your thesis to be very clear as far as what your paper is going to be about, but you also don't want to word things in a way that is offensive to your readers because they won't read on. For example, in the last thesis statement, we saw that the writer was going to compare the Northerners and Southerners on the issue of slavery and how they viewed slavery. You are not saying whether the North was right or the South was right because you're just comparing and contrasting. The place and medium. The physical place where readers are reading may affect how closely they're reading and dictate what you need to highlight for them. Anything you write in college, you're assuming your teacher is reading in an appropriate place. But in the real world, you're going to have to think about this. Are they going to be reading this document online? Like, is this an email or a blog or some kind of addition to a website? Or is this something that comes written across someone's desk and I expect them to be in one spot and reading it? Also, if any of you want to actually write a fiction book or a short story someday, you don't know where people might read your work. They could be under a tree, relaxing, and you need to identify any current trends or events that might affect your reader's understanding of your writing. So what social trends affect your topic? How do economic trends influence the situation? How does your project touch on political trends?